Hi, I'm 20O'Neil and I'm here today to talk to you about the role of the backbone. I'm talking to you about this because I've had a little bit of experience both in talking to other people and exploring what is this role of the backbone, what are the key features of the backbone, what are the skill sets that we need to do that. And part of this comes from my own experience of being the CEO of Lifeline for over 10 years. So in that role, Lifeline, for those of you that know, the organisation is a it's a federation of over 42 organisations. So when I first joined the organisation, there were 42 separate boards, and they were really 42 separate organisations, although operating under one brand. And you can imagine the task of trying to get everybody on the same page, everybody focused on the same priorities, developing a common strategic plan, common key messages, and a common focus for our work was not an easy task. So I used to talk about it as herding cats, and it often felt like that. So some of my experiences and the thinking that I bring into this conversation around what it is to be a backbone organisation, what is that role of a backbone, comes from that experience of leading that organisation towards where we did eventually arrive, which was a very common goal around answering all of our calls and preventing suicide. But it took a long time to get to that point. So the backbone functions. Backbone work or the backbone function is one of the key elements of the collective impact framework. It's last on the list, but it's certainly not last on the list because it's the least important. It is the critical element that people have said is essential to have in place to enable the coordinating efforts and the collective efforts to occur effectively. Those that have experienced doing collective impact work have said that unless there is an organisation or a couple of organisations fulfilling all of the functions that I'll talk about in a moment, the work really can't happen successfully. When you're talking about systems change with many, many organisations, many stakeholders, many people to communicate over many years, there has to be ideally an independent entity or a couple of independent entities to coordinate that effort and do the communications and focus on aligning the effort that needs to occur to achieve the common agenda and measure that work. So FSG, who originally published this work in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, have conducted a number of large forums talking to many organisations and people involved in backbone work. And part of what they've done in those meetings and in those get-togethers is to ask people, what are the key functions that backbones need to do that makes them effective? What are the key pieces of work that backbones need to actually do? So I'm just going to run through those and talk about them individually. The backbone functions, first of all, obviously, is to guide the vision and strategy. It's very easy with large groups of people to get off track. So a backbone's role is very much to help stay focused on that vision and strategy, to remind people, remember what the common agenda is, remember what the common measures are. So to keep everybody focused on that. Secondly, to support the aligned activities. There are generally in collective impact initiatives many working groups working behind the scenes in separate parts of the system, focused on the various short, medium or long-term goals that the organisation or the initiative might have. So keeping those aligned activities going, keeping that work going in between meetings is really important. So they have a big role in supporting the aligned activities. Establishing the shared measurement practices is also critical. Those shared measurement practices and the shared measurements overall, sometimes, I've talked about this so far as functions, but sometimes those functions can be facilitated by separate organisations. More often than not, it is a separate entity, and importantly, it needs to be an independent entity. So it's not a service provider, it's not a recipient of funds, it's not competing with the service providers for funds, so it can be independent and keep everybody focused. But often the measurement practices and the measurement processes, doing the evaluation work, gathering the shared data, that can be sometimes done by a separate entity, or it can be done by the single backbone organisation. So establishing the shared measurement practices and communicating how we're tracking on the things that we're measuring, that's a key part of the function of the backbone work. Building public will, obviously engaging with people with a lived experience, whatever the issue is that you're focused on, is really critical to the work. And of course, engaging with the community and building public will, really critical. Oftentimes there might be policy changes that need to occur, and you might need a lot of leverage with influencers to try and change those policies or change that legislation or shift the way that funding is allocated in your region. So building public will so that you can put pressure on influencers is really critical. And also so that the whole community is behind whatever the goal is of the collective impact work. Really important that everybody's involved. So that's a key part of the work. Advancing policy that I've also mentioned. Getting good policy developed and in place is critical to shifting systems. So much of our systems is driven by policy work. So advancing policy work is really critical, feeding that up into people who make those decisions and set those policy in place. And last but not least, mobilising the funding. Funding, of course, is critical to this work, critical to the service provision on the ground. So mobilising more funding where it's needed, and being able to access and leverage the funding that already exists in the community. And that might mean pooling funding of the various entities that are involved in the collective impact work. So mobilising funding is critical as well. So they're the 6 functions of the backbone. Backbones have to balance the tension between coordinating and maintaining accountability while staying behind the scenes to establish collective ownership. So one of the things about collective impact and backbone functions is that the backbone is not the one out the front. They're not the ones that get all of the money. They're not the lead agency. It's a very different role. So they have to stay behind the scenes. They have to be really good listeners. They have to be constantly curious about the data and what's happening in the system around them, garnering all of that information, gathering it all together and making sense of it for the people on the ground that are wanting to align their effort towards the common agenda. So it's a very different skill set. Some of the skills that are needed to do the work, and I've just put up a list here. This is only some of the skills, so it is highly skilled work. Convening leadership, having either being able to convene leaders from the community or having them within the backbone, but more often than not, that leadership is within the community somewhere. But being able to convene them together to lead the work and keep everybody focused on the work year on year. This is long-term work. So convening leadership is really critical, and getting people or encouraging people, mobilising people that are energised by the work and can stay focused on the work. Inclusion, being really conscious in all of your communications and all of your work to include everybody. Think about all the parts of the system, all the parts of government, all the parts of business, all the parts of the community that need to be involved and need to be informed and need to be kept up to date with what's happening in the change. Stakeholder communications and engagement, a really critical skill set. And that's a particular skill set that backbones need to be able to have. How to communicate with all the parts of the system in an appropriate way, so not in a way that bombards people with information. Being able to visualise data, for example, is a really key way. Using film, using creative means to communicate to people what's happening and how we're progressing with our agenda. You need good process experts, so people who are really good at process. How do you keep people engaged? How do you make sure the work happens in between meetings and it gets fed back to people in ways that they've got adequate time to read it and it's easy to read, and you conduct your meetings in a way that are engaging and get you to a result. So those sort of processes and systems are really important. You also need people that are content experts, whatever the issue is that you're trying to solve, if it's homelessness or mental illness or suicide prevention, whatever the wicked problem is that you're trying to tackle. You need people that have good content knowledge or can gather that content knowledge together from the community. I've talked about leadership, and facilitative skills or facilitation skills are really critical as well. So really good facilitators. So I think one of the things that I've learnt that may not necessarily be in your community. You may not have all the facilitation skills you need. So I think developing a bit of a community of practice around facilitation is really crucial. So those facilitators that are leading meetings and convening workshops, etc., continue to build on their skills and get feedback on how they're doing. So you really notice the difference between someone who's a good chair and someone who's not a good chair. And too often we actually don't get a lot of training to do that work. So support and training and coaching is really critical. And then again, the last thing on this list, but this is only just some of the skills. Discipline, systems and processes. This is disciplined work. We have to be credible around the data. We have to feed it back regularly. We have to be disciplined around timing. We can't let things slip. So it's really important to apply best management skills around change management and all the things that we know around systems change and process improvement. So they're just some of the things. They've been adapted from the Collaborative Leadership Handbook written by David Crislip, so I encourage you to have a look at that. Might give you some tips as to where you can get more information. And of course there's more information on Collaboration for Impact. But all of that is summarised by the key function of a backbone, and that is to build trust. What backbones have to do is build trust in the community and amongst all of the stakeholders that are involved in achieving the collective impact. Investing in trust building pays off. It's really important to invest in that, and that takes time and effort and energy. If trust is low, then things are going to take longer and it's going to cost more. But if trust builds and trust grows, then things take less time and cost less. So investing in trust is a key feature of the backbone, and that's the thing that you need to get right. Thank you very much. I hope that's been helpful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this discussion about backbones today.